The National Schools Debating Championships 2022 would like to thank our premier partners, the Australian National University and Crimson Education, our major partner, the University of Canberra Faculty of Business, Government and Law, and our sponsor, Speaking Schools Australasia, for their support in making this tournament happen.
Panel, the fundamental problem with the status quo and why this debate is taking place is because the curriculum and the schooling system targets the average student. It says if you are in grade 9, if you are in grade 10, you are of a certain ability, you are of a certain subject aptitude, therefore. And the problem with that is that it's simply not the case. Age is only like a correlative determinant of these kinds of things. We think not all people are the average student. The status quo cannot cater for like particularly high and low achieving individuals because and this has a flow-on problem that teachers aim to solve themselves by like in the classroom by like trying to help the high and low students more, leading to consequences to the average student, making that worse. It also makes teachers' lives worse. We fix all of these problems the point at which we fundamentally change the structure of the education system by allowing like each student to progress based on their ability rather than the ascriptive attribute of age. And we think that's so important. Okay, then on the stance, we think we will like designate classes for students based on their ability separately within each subject. That is like they'll be in a different grade for each subject. We think that looks like if you're like brain clicks with math and you're just like 1 year ahead conceptually in that subject, but at the average level at the other subjects, that is just the situation in which you will find yourself. We think we streamline this firstly by looking at grades of a previous year, but also by talking to the student. We then offer, we think ordinarily these people will go up by like 1 grade, as is typically the case, but they may be advised to go up 2 if that is suitable, or they may be advised to just stay back and do some more in that grade. Okay, then on the first point of standard in speech, how we improve educational outcomes for all students. And the first thing how I'm going to explain this point to you, no thank you, is that I'm going to break it down into firstly individuals that are above average, then those who are below in academic achievement, and finally how that incurs harms and benefits to like the average student. Okay, firstly on above. Under the status quo, no thank you, from an academic perspective, we think these individuals find themselves being explained things they already intuitively understand or perhaps remember from the previous year to the extent that it is a cyclical system. And the reason for that was like simple, but like, it's actually quite complex, which was that they just have superior cognitive capacity. Maybe they just have like more significant passions. They research it out of class. Maybe they have just better work ethic for like whatever reason. And the combination of factors has just led to this situation in which they are just like not partaking in the class to a meaningful extent. The implication of this is that they are sitting in class, they are disenfranchised from school to the extent it is not providing utility to them directly. They are unmotivated to the extent that school tells them getting an A is what it means to be like participating in school functionally, and they are doing that. And like the impacts of that therein is that they switch off, they do not participate in school, they develop bad study habits because those things are of intrinsic importance, and now they're just like going to switch off and sort of not develop that ability to work. And I'll take you in a second, and to come across obstacles. We think, and I'll take it to you. Yeah.
Do you believe that younger kids are developmentally equipped to deal with the academic pressures of all these levels?
Yeah, absolutely, because we're going to put them in a year above if they are developmentally equipped to deal with the academic pressures. We think that's just how that's going to work. That's an assessment that teachers are more than capable of making in any case. So we think at best, you're just like wasting years of these individual lives. But at worst, you're like boring them to the extent that they disenfranchise from school in perpetuity, and then they like just develop significant harms in terms of their inability to work in other capacities. Okay, then on the second stakeholder in this point, which is those who are performing below expected levels academically. And note there's just sort of similar harms, but through a different mechanism, which is that every time you get back a test that says you failed, you are like you are perturbed by that and that like rubs in your face that you are like not doing well. And it also makes all of the work that you have done to achieve that seem inconsequential, making you less likely to work in the future. We think this occurs because you missed something foundationally, like you missed like how fractions work or something in grade 7, and then you just perpetuate that harm indefinitely, to the point at which you just continue to give them back papers that were continuously based on that metric of them having missed something at an earlier date. We think we fix that in a number of ways. Firstly, they just have not missed that foundational element to the extent that they cannot, like they're less likely to leave that grade until they do so. Secondly, they get better grades, which is a benefit in of itself, because it means that they're actually learning more things Secondly, that benefit doesn't just have the benefit of them really learning, it also has the benefit of them getting positive affirmation that validates the work they did, that reinforces their work ethic, that reinforces, most importantly, that they can actually do school in a way that makes them much more likely to participate in the long run. To that benefit, but it also opens up tertiary education to a significant extent, because the point at which you were just the point at which you were just 1 year behind your peers, in like literature or something, but otherwise you would have been at whatever you were passionate at, you would have been a great lawyer or whatever, you would have been a great doctor, but you just were 2-3 years behind in some foundational skill. We just allow those individuals to finish at their own rate, and a rate at which allows them to achieve their passions, but just a little bit on a different schedule. And we think to the extent that everyone develops differently, and because age is ascriptive, like I've said, and age is not directly determinant of these factors. That is the reason that is so important. Finally, and quickly on the average student, we think to the extent that teachers are capable of recognizing all of the previous problems do exist, they therefore aim to correct them themselves in the limited capacity to which they can do so. That looks like creating extension material. That looks like giving targeted help to students who need special consideration. The people that suffer from that is those who are in the middle of the bell curve, who literally don't get direct teacher involvement for the vast majority of the time because they're too busy addressing these systematic problems with the educational system. We think the harm of that is quite systematic. It means that these individuals don't get help when they do end up struggling. It means that they don't get extended when they are doing well, so they just stay average and eventually become worse. And we think that is just a significant harm within the education system in of itself. The impact at the end of this entire point is that we get educational experiences that are better for every student. Everyone is more motivated to work to the extent they don't perceive things to be unattainable, and they don't perceive things to be too easy and just not worth their time. We also, in principle, get a quality of education because these individuals because these individuals who were not held back based on some arbitrary metric of age, or were not forced to do things that they shouldn't otherwise be doing on some arbitrary metric. That was equality. Okay, then on the second point of the speech with regard to social outcomes, and I'll take you.
Yeah, given that people who already skip a year or two at school have a harder time feeding with their peers, considering they're considered more immature, how would your take on it?
I'm going to deal with that in the second point right now, which is about social outcomes. So why do we think students feel left out socially? We think it is because, firstly, those who are at an above average level for their subject, they struggle to relate to their peers. Their peers don't engage in the same interests and the same hobbies that they do, and that leaves them feeling generally disenfranchised from everyone around them. We think there are the same reasons for this that I illustrated in the first point, which is just perhaps they have a general passion or general work ethic with regard to learning things about the news and things like that, and that's what they want to talk about with their peers, but they cannot do so because they aren't on the same conceptual level. We think how we fix that is the point at which these individuals are in the right class for their age. That is they're in year 11 literature when they're in year 9 or something. That's the point at which they can hold a conversation that is actually meaningful to them and is actually meaningful and actually forms some kind of connection in a way that really benefits them. We think you probably should relate to people more fundamentally, the point at which you have similar interests, you think in similar capacities, you have similar ways of thinking. That probably just lets you getting better friends and friends who are older, and that was good. On the flip side, people who are worse off in their grade, just look around and everyone is speaking about things they don't understand. That is socially disenfranchising, the point at which you can't talk at lunch with your peers about the kinds of things that they value. The impact of this, firstly, is we get more individuals just having more friends, which is a benefit in of itself, especially to the extent that incentivizes them to go to school, to feel passionate about going to school. That has flow-on effects into their education. But secondly, we think you get not just more friends, but better friends. You get friends who extend you, friends who hold you to a high standard, and that is to a constant practical benefit to your life. We think we stop people from disenfranchising socially due to disparity in ability. We think we fix all of these problems in the status quo, and we are for saving the education system and this fundamental problem it poses to every single individual in the education system. We are so proud to propose.
Speaker, the problem that the affirmative team has identified is that individuals are either being left behind or they're not getting enough. We tell you this does in no way justify such a radical reform to this education system, which will actually propagate academic disenfranchisement and perpetuate emotional damage. And this model that they presented as this sort of be-all, end-all to suddenly reform our education system will probably actually lead to more harms than the benefits that they are presenting. So 3 key questions in this debate. Firstly, why their side actually has a negative impact on the function of the educational system. Then on principle, on substantive, why academic ability isn't actually fundamentally the right way to group people. And secondly, how this overall would hinder social development. Okay, so let's look at what the affirmative team said. And on this point of responsive, on the negative impact on the education system. A few things here. Firstly, like let's look at their model. I think the very first thing to identify is that they played it almost very safe. Like they identified no, thank you. They identified very marginal benefits because in primary school in particular, when we accelerate a year, when we decelerate a year, there is realistically very little difference when it comes to like the sort of academic challenges that you will be receiving. Instead, what we find is that there will be the people who are older who like instead what we find is that when we accelerate years, there's actually a larger emotional gap, and what that means is that that likely entails like much more difficult emotional interactions with their peers, much more difficulty in like fitting in socially, and like far from like succeeding academically. Like secondly, on this point of like the fact that teachers are probably going to be less stressed, less spread out, and like that's something that they really brought up in their introduction. I think the first thing to acknowledge here is that this is like a fundamentally wrong assertion. Firstly, because what the teachers have is like this sort of tendency to focus on the middle, like the average class, and like that's something like they completely conveniently dismissed with the fact like they asserted that teachers like wouldn't focus on people in the middle of the bell curve. We tell you what's going to happen instead is that we're going to shove like that sort of child who's like say underdeveloped academically into that group of younger people, and what's going to happen, they're just going to be ignored. The education system is going to claim that they somehow succeeded, that they're somehow grouping them in this sort of academic way, and like leave them without a sort of teaching assistant to analyze why they're having that trouble with their learning, which we believe is really the key issue here that the affirmative team has largely ignored. Furthermore, we tell you like realistically, on the logistic level, people have different abilities in different subjects. Somebody may be good at English, yes, somebody may be good at lit, but they may not be good at mathematics. So how is that teacher then meant to identify? How are we meant to group them by their academic ability when it's not like this sort of like uniform thing that the like uniform world that the affirmative team has presented? And I'll take a point now.
Our model literally suggests that we're going to group students subject by subject basis. Why doesn't that mitigate all of the harms we just talked about?
Yeah, okay. So like firstly logistically, say somebody is like say somebody is say year 3 English, like they're year 3 or they're year 3 English, but they have that academic ability of being like in year 8 math. So overall we tell you like your model is quite inefficient because it provides no sort of compromise, and ultimately what happens is that individual is not only being hindered academically, but they're actually in this situation where they're unable to socially interact with people who are realistically much older than them, who realistically have different conversations, have different interests, and like overall that like minimizes their exposure to their own year group. And so like onto this principle, why isn't academic ability the correct way to group people? A few things here. So what do we have in our current system? We do have these sorts of academic extension programs. We do have support as an option, which again then does not justify the fact that we will suddenly reform like that sort of education system. So what we have, the reason we have the system is really to combine that social and academic development that allows it allows these kids to actually go out and interact with the world in the most sophisticated way possible. And so why has that been successful? We tell you like most kids are pretty content where they are. We don't see like kids like suddenly skipping all these years because they feel like they're academically underchallenged. We don't like likewise see them being like held back in this sort of way because they feel like they're not being supported enough. And so what happens there, no thank you, is we have people being able to come out of the school and interact with it in a pretty reasonable and functional way. Okay, so why does actually grouping kids undermine this? A few things here. Firstly, we tell you the key thing to understand here, and I push this throughout my responses, is the fact that academic ability is not equivalent to maturity. And this is really going in direct response to what they said. So what we tell you is that just because somebody is good at like memorizing their times tables and like functionally at primary school, a lot of our education system is based on rote learning because that is the way we introduce kids to education. And so what happens, it's really an ode to their memory or like the way they can absorb that knowledge, but not actually reflective of the way that they critically think, which becomes more and more important as they grow up. And even if we do have outliers, as I mentioned before, our education system is largely focused on that bulk, and we have to address that bulk in mass education and not completely reform it just because a couple of people aren't satisfied with the year level. For example, if we had a kid who knew that times tables, say like primary school, we're not going to put them in the group of year 4s who also know the times tables. That notion is utterly ridiculous developed enough. They don't have that maturity to interact with their peers. So like overall, why does that make that worse? No, thank you. So we tell you like that sort of maturity gap leads to a bad social development, and this really actually bleeds into my second point of substantive. How does that hinder social development? So like a few things here. Like firstly, let's take a look at relationships. There are two key parts to this. Firstly, in terms of friendships, when kids predominantly like are in younger or older years, that ultimately leads them to being like less exposed to people of the age group. And so even if they go out and like see them at lunchtime, ultimately there is like too little time to bond with those peers on like issues that are traditionally like developed within class. And we tell you that these kids, contrary to what the affirmative team said, don't just want to talk about school. They want to talk about their hobbies. They want to talk about their interests, and they simply cannot always do that with people who are a different age, who are at a different developmental stage to them. And so like overall, we tell you like we tell you like there is also like this sort of chance that these kids will be bullying on two levels. Firstly, like say they are held down, they will be perceived as this sort of like dumb idiot, and that's because kids are probably traditionally pretty irrational. They like seek to find out differences in people, and like so that psychological mentality does not lead into like cognitive like just a solid emotional understanding, which would prevent them from bullying them for this like reason. And in a similar way, there is like that sort of danger of being perceived as like an overly smart nerd. And again, what that means is that like people who are your age will view you in like less than like favorable light, and that really prevents those sorts of friendships, those sort of relationships forming, and ultimately leads to conversations in which like that kid may be talking about things that are either beyond their needs, like for example, like dangerous topics that are really only discussed in high school, like for example, alcohol and drugs, and they may not necessarily be aware of like aware like in terms of like their decision making of like the true magnitude of like this negative impact, or else they may be taking social cues from like a much younger sphere. And what that means is that when they go out into the world, when they go and meet people their age, they're unable to adequately interact with those individuals, and for these reasons procrastinate.
Let's be very, very clear at this stage of the debate. The purpose of school was to educate. Students could always find other avenues for socializing, whether it be extracurriculars, hanging out with peers at lunchtime, or just out of school, making connections with friends and people you care about. The fundamental obligation of school was to teach students information, which meant that they could leave that institution a better person for themselves and for society. We told you in our first speech, to an inadequate response, that the status quo fundamentally fails students who are most vulnerable. It tells students who are struggling in grade 8 math and then like are stunted with mathematics for the rest of their educational life that it is something they are bad at, and that because of that they should probably just disengage and like not continue to work to the extent that they should. It takes students who are exceptional learners and puts them in an environment which stunts their growth and educational ability because they do not have the avenues of challenge and extension that they need in order to engage meaningfully in the educational institution. Average students are forced to exist in classrooms where teachers are overworked and overburdened by an incredibly diverse group of students that they do not know how to adequately like deal with, and that was the problem with this debate. I'm going to bring you two questions in rebuttal before some substantive contributions. Firstly, I'm going to talk about educational outcomes, and then I'm going to talk about emotional outcomes and the social aspect. No, thank you. Firstly, on educational outcomes. Note why this is the most important aspect of this debate. Because school was literally the only place where most people could access this education. So obviously, the school's main job in this debate was to educate students and to teach students in a way that was meaningful and efficient for them. Social aspect was something that we could talk about in this debate, but that fundamentally wasn't important when there were other avenues to access that. There was no other access, no thank you for school. That is why it was most important. Okay, let's talk about primary schools quickly. They tell you there's not a huge difference in like academic ability depending on different grades. I think it's super important to note that there is for some students, and that the fact that under the status quo, a number of students in primary school are challenged and do not succeed, and because of that, for the rest of their school life, they think that school is not a place for them, and they think that educational institutes are not a place where they can succeed. That's incredibly, incredibly harmful, because you are literally taking students at one of their most like at a stage where they're developing most no thank you, and like telling them that they cannot succeed in this institution because you continue to put them in classes where they like do not understand the content and they do not have the resources to succeed. So even if it is true that not all students in primary school are going to be like do change the students who absolutely need it most, that was a benefit for us. On secondary schooling, they tell us academic challenge programs exist. Before I explain why, sure.
If the issue is that kids aren't actually getting enough support, why not simply increase the level of support rather than disrupt the entire system?
Because it's incredibly hard for schools to A, know which students to prioritize all of the time, but secondly, to allocate resources effectively. It's incredibly hard to make like challenge programs or support programs for every specific class, for every specific student. It is just easier for schools and governments to make decisions which group academic like ability and then can like target resources to that specific academic ability instead of on an individual basis. Obviously, our policy is just more efficient. On academic challenge programs, they just are clinically underfunded and under-resourced, which means that they just are not effective as literally having a teacher in classes every single day, which like challenge you in that specific way. They themselves can see that academic challenge programs exist. If we tell you that every single class then is challenging the students that need it, but catering for the students who don't, obviously we win this debate. So what did we tell you in secondary school that wasn't really responded to? We told you firstly that students who are like on the bottom end of the bell curve are fundamentally neglected by schools. They are told that like they are not worth like investing in because they have continued to fail in the specific classes. That was not a fault of their own because of reasons, structural reasons we gave you in our speech, that age was not like the mechanism through which like academic development was like meant through. Obviously, people developed at different rates. Schools needed to deal with that in a necessary way. Okay. Second question in this speech: emotional and social outcomes. I think it's important to note that when they say schools should aim to teach social skills, that the way you did that wasn't necessarily through putting people in classes with everyone with the same age as them. We don't think it is true that individuals cannot communicate with people of different ages. We point to debating teams in this tournament where people are in grade 12, 11, and 10, and sometimes even 9, and you just like continue to work in a space that is productive and meaningful in that way. We think absolutely individuals can interact with people in different grades. Know that like the most extreme example is probably just like a grade 12 in a class of grade 8. We don't think that's likely. The likely difference is probably just 1 or 2 years, in which case you're not that dissimilar. You can absolutely communicate. You can absolutely create social connections. Yeah.
Yeah. Given that you're capping the movement up and down to just like 1 or 2 years, where do your benefits lie in that like it's not going to make that much of a difference academically, but for a younger child that is a huge step, like that is a huge age difference developmentally.
We're not capping the amount you can move. We're just saying that most people probably won't move that much. Obviously, if you're in grade 3 and you're doing math at a grade 6 level or grade like crazy grade 8 level, obviously we're happy to move you. We just don't think it's that likely. We think most people probably just continue to exist in like age groups similar to them. Okay, on maturity and development. It is fundamentally true that there are just other avenues through which you can get this maturity. Extracurriculars continue to exist, and I'm going to talk about why they get better and substantive. So with that in mind, first point of substantive contribution, why we get better and more equipped teachers. I think it's important, firstly, to note the nature of the status quo, and that is the fact that teachers are fundamentally forced to dedicate time to expanding gifted learners, time to like the struggling learners, but also time and energy into those in the middle. They are fundamentally, no thank you, overworked, overburdened, underslept, and literally like pushed to their very, very edge in order to get the most out of the students. This led to colossal harms. Teachers feeling like, no thank you, they failed even though the system was like rigged against them and that they never were going to get the most out of the students because that was just the nature of the educational system under the status quo. They were fundamentally spread too thin. That led to huge harms for students as well as the individuals. No thank you. Why do we empower teachers? Firstly, because we let them spend their time more effectively and we let them plan more effectively. When you know that everyone in your class is on the same level of learning, you can target plans to be more efficient and to be more effective. You can do your teaching in such a way that you know that a student isn't disengaging or doesn't know where you're up to, and that you're going to have to go and spend more time with them afterwards. You know that everyone is on a similar playing field, so you're able to teach more effectively. That's incredibly important. But secondly, no thank you. Teachers feel like they can succeed. They know that now that the class, they're not going to have to spend heaps and heaps of hours doing like heaps of work for different students, and they know that that they are empowered to do their very, very best. That's incredibly important, not just for teachers but also for students. Because teachers can feel better at work. They're obviously going to teach more effectively. No, thank you. That means that we are going to get huge benefits for students because if teachers feel more empowered and are just more empowered, obviously they're able to get more benefits for the students and are able to teach in a way that is more effective. But secondly, we think that teachers probably just feel better. No, thank you, and that's important in debate winning in and of itself. Okay, at the end of this speech, when we talk about extracurriculars, this is my second point for substantive. A few mechanisms why people are more likely to engage in extracurriculars under our side. Firstly, heaps of students under the status quo are hugely disillusioned with schools. They think that the institution is simply not a place for them, which means that they do not want to spend extra time doing things like chess club or like rugby or soccer or debating or things like that, because they fundamentally feel like when they walk through those school gates, this is not a place for them, and they are consistently don't understand what's going on and feel completely disillusioned with the institution. We think that's a mechanism why people don't engage. Secondly, we think schools and parents probably just don't allow it. You tell struggling students that because you're failing in this class, it's rigged against you. You're not allowed to participate in other things. Thirdly, it's probably quite inaccessible for some individuals. School resourcing means that you have to spend money on like challenge programs and things like that. When you decrease like the resource burden there, you're probably able to allocate funds more effectively. All of this is incredibly important because extracurriculars were an important aspect of schooling. It taught you skills that you didn't always necessarily get in the classroom. That was incredibly important. At the end of this speech, what side opposition had to do was deal with the nature of the status quo, which is that literally every single student in class was doomed to fail. They were not on the same level, and the teachers were always rigged to fail. So proud to propose.
Speaker, in this debate, the opposition focused extremely on the importance of education over the social impacts that are involved with this motion. But we tell you that you cannot actually have adequate educational outcomes if we do not allow students to have a positive social experience at schools. We tell you that for students to achieve to their highest level, they need to be motivated, they need to feel engaged, they need to feel like they're not going to be bullied for walking into a classroom being years older than their peers or at a different maturity. We tell you that we need to contend with both sides of this debate. Okay, so three things I'll be doing in this speech. Firstly, a discussion of academic success. Secondly, a discussion of social impacts. And finally, a substantive contribution, how this impacts pressure on students. So, firstly, as far as academic success is concerned, I think we've outlined kind of the three main stakeholders we have in this sense. So, firstly, when we talk about these above average students, and the opposition were very keen to kind of outline the necessity of stimulating these kids and keeping them engaged, and saying that they don't really get that at the status quo because they are kept with students of their own age. We tell you that firstly, in situations where we're talking mainly about a few years of difference, for a lot of these students, this isn't actually going to adequately stimulate them. In most cases, this is not actually going to change the education they're receiving all that much. And secondly, we tell you that the actual education you receive, the difference that probably happens, particularly when we're talking about primary schools, is probably going to be slightly harder multiplication. It's probably going to be reading a slightly more difficult book. What it doesn't actually look like is engaging students in actual critical thinking skills. No, thank you. In changing the way they engage with their education, in challenging their minds. And these really high achieving students need that level of engagement that they don't just get from moving from year 7 to year 8. We need to actually offer them an alternative. And what we support on our side of the house is actually helpful academic extension programs that have a different sort of curriculum for these students that allow them to engage, no thank you, in kind of education that stimulates them in a different way, makes them think in a way that standardized education simply isn't able to. So then in terms of these less academically inclined students who generally aren't doing as well, and the opposition told you that they feel kind of this demotivation, they're disenfranchised by the system, and therefore there's kind of this cyclical cycle of them continuing to do worse. So why do we tell you this is actually worse on their side? Firstly, we tell you that their motivation, if anything, is going to decrease when they're with less able kids. There's no actual impetus for them to kind of try and achieve more as there would be in a mainstream classroom. They're being put with children who are generally less able than them. They don't have that same incentive to achieve highly. But secondly, we tell you that oftentimes at the status quo, these kids are probably already with education assistants within the classroom. They're already being helped, and that stays the same under their side. What actually happens is when these kids are put into classrooms where they are kids of a lower age level, the school feels like they're already meeting their requirements. They're already doing what they need to do. And therefore, these children are not actually going to get the individualized help and assistance that they so fundamentally need to actually achieve highly academically longer term, which we see as being exceptionally important because it's not just about these students being able to achieve in the moment. It's about them being given the tools to actually achieve success in the long term as adults. And then finally, onto these kind of more average students. We tell you that often these kids actually ultimately lose out, even if they're with kids of the same age as they would be at the status quo. We tell you that when there's higher achieving students in the classroom, it actually elevates the standard of education within that room. Questions are being asked that might extend these students. They're kind of being exposed to higher achievers, which actually gives them motivation motivation. It gives them the ability to actually see something they probably won't see if everyone's at like exactly the same level. Yeah.
To the extent classrooms are for work, what stops a student from leaving their like year 9 math class and going to sit with their year 7 peers, or like going to just like to a friend's house or something like that?
We think that like a lot of your social life occurs like within the classroom, right? Like you're constantly interacting with your peers, you're constantly engaging with them the same way like you do in a workplace. Like there's a social aspect there as well. And therefore we say like even if they could experience a social life outside of school, there is an impact explicitly in them actually having an experience within the classroom that makes this worse for them, that makes it like harder for them to actually achieve the best social outcomes. Okay, so then secondly on to like these like social impacts. Like fundamentally we tell you that school is at least in part a social experience, and it's actually what gives like children the ability to actually like engage with society like longer term. It's not purely about the education, particularly when we're talking about like primary schools, younger children. It's not just about learning your times tables, it's also about learning to engage with your peers in a way that will allow you to like succeed as an adult. So then how do we see this like impacts like students who are above average? And the opposition told you that they would like be better able to connect with their peers, able to have better conversations. We tell you that firstly, these students are just as able to have conversations with their peers as anyone else. We don't see that this as being like any sort of great benefit. We see kids probably aren't talking about their news. They're probably talking about like the footy game on the weekend, what their friends are doing. We don't think this is really a benefit. But secondly, we tell you that these students are probably going to become increasingly stressed, increasingly pressured. They're probably going to have this sense of like othering from the kids who are their own age because they're seen as so completely separate and so completely distinct that they're not actually able to engage meaningfully with kids of their own age. But then like why this is like worse on the opposition side, we said they're like increasingly separated, increasingly less able to really engage with their peers. And then how this impacts like students who are traditionally conceived to be below average. They told you that these students are going to be better able to like interact with others easily. And why we tell this is untrue. We tell them like firstly they're likely going to get bullied. We outlined this to you at first, where we tell you where they're going to be in a situation where they are seen to be less academically able, and it's very publicly aware that if you're in a year level that is like far below what you like should be in, there's going to be a sense of difference, and children are going to capitalize that because fundamentally children aren't really always particularly nice people. But then secondly, we tell you that this really impacts the self-esteem of these children, and particularly if we're talking about these like younger students, it's very difficult to explain to an 8-year-old why they're being brought down by like so much, why they're not being seen as the same as their peers, and really can impact the way they perceive their actual academic ability long term. So then like finally in this like social like idea about like these extracurriculars, we tell you that this is like a largely symmetric benefit, that children will engage with like sports on either side. They will engage probably in debating if they have interest on either side. But rather we believe it's like more important that they're actually able to engage with like different children within their school community. And if you're able to do that and don't feel othered within your school, you are more likely to actually engage with these activities in a meaningful way. Then finally on to like pressure and the way this impacts students. We tell you at the status quo, we have huge issues with like mental health, with anxiety, with depression, with these students in schools because they are under this increasing level of pressure. And we see this happening in 3 main ways. Firstly, children receiving pressure from school gets worse on this side because we tell you as school years go up, these students are exposed to like more stress progressively from like year 1 to year 12. It slowly increases, so kids have the ability to actually learn to adapt and to deal with this increasing pressure. You don't actually get that on the opposition side. But B, we tell you this is a situation where like students now have the ability to completely control kind of like what year they're in, and therefore it like creates this pressure for them to push beyond what is actually realistic for them, and for the school to put that additional pressure on these students. Rather than focusing on grades, you're focusing on what year level you're in. We tell you this is like too much pressure to put on these students. We tell you that secondly, this happens in terms of parents within households and it impacts the family unit, to the extent that parents already often put unrealistic expectations on their children. This only becomes worse when like the year group your child is in becomes a social symbol, puts increasing pressure on the child. And then thirdly, we see this impacts the way the child actually sees themselves and the pressure they put on themselves, in that tests no longer just have value in terms of your numerical grade, but it's also the degree to which you're able to engage with your peers, the situation you have at school. And for these reasons, because we get worse pressure for these students, we cannot stand by that on our side of the house. So proud to negate.
Before I get into 2 issues within this debate, I'd like to start off just by responding to the 2 ones so I don't forget. Firstly, we think that actually stress in education is probably a good thing. And I think that the status quo means that lots of students are not extended and actually are forced to not really engage with school whatsoever when they are at an age level that is significantly below with their actual mental development. I think the ability for someone to need to put work in is probably actually on net a good thing. Because I think what doesn't happen under our side is people get put into classes that is actively stressing them out. They get put in classes which are designed to extend them somewhat because that's how you get better by the end of the year. I think actually the pressure we get is far healthier because these students that are currently dramatically pressured get that alleviated, and the students that have no pressure whatsoever now have work ethic. But additionally, I don't think that you do see yourself as worse when you're in a younger age group. The reason that is, I think you see yourself as dramatically worse when you do not get good grades and when you're constantly getting told that you're failing. I think that it's probably true that that maybe when you initially go into a lower grade, you feel slightly bad about that. But as soon as the fact that you see an A on your test, no thank you, and that's the first time that has ever happened to you, that is a dramatic confidence boost. It's a belief that now you can do whatever you want to do after school. You can succeed in school, no thank you. I think that actually we're dramatically able to alleviate mental health pressure under our side. After that, a couple of issues in this debate. Firstly, just on the educational outcomes of schools. Secondly, on the social impacts on students. No thank you. Let's firstly talk about the educational outcomes on schools, because I think the main push that side negative wants to make in here is that it's true that students have different levels of ability, but they're able to cater for that instead through things such as like extension programs and through things such as learning support. Why do we think these systems are likely not very sufficient? Firstly, no thank you. I think we've already established that they do mean that you, for example, need to like have extra teachers on site. They do necessarily mean that you need to hire more people. It is a comparatively far more costly process, meaning that we can extend these same resources on just like improving curricula for everyone under our side. But secondly, I think that it's probably just a really halfway metric to what we're able to achieve. Because I think that if you're taken out of class every day to go to academic extension, you're also not talking to everyone in that class. Likewise, that's exactly the same for learning support. So I think they probably suffer a lot of these social harms that they want to support, except they don't get the full academic benefit because you are like smart enough to do grade 12 when you're doing grade 12 work. You just haven't finished it, even though you could have under our side. I think comparatively, that was a halfway metric that we were able to get in full. So what instead what did they say in this debate? Okay, let's firstly talk about these students that were currently above their general age level, because what their response to no thank you. So what we told you from first was that they already likely understand a lot of the content, particularly given educational systems are really cyclical. You cover a lot of the same content year on year. People that naturally get it the first time round are likely to be able to extend beyond that. I think, I don't think it really matters for educational purposes how many grades you extend by. I think that some people do just like graduate grade 12 maths in like grade 9 because they're smart enough, and some people just like go up a bit. But I think that means that it is able to change a lot if you're just smart enough for it to change a lot. And if you're like smart enough for it to change a bit, I think that's probably good. I think when they were talking about really marginal differences, that's really marginal differences for people that needed really marginal differences. For people that needed significant differences, we could get that. That's why we were able to get people that didn't switch off in class. Those were all of the benefits we told you about work ethic. That meant that when suddenly it eventually would become slightly more difficult, people were prepared to deal with that. People were more likely to succeed. That was a colossal benefit because that meant that the people that started off smart, no thank you, never got disenfranchised from school. Secondly, on the people that were currently struggling from an academic perspective still, they say that the specific thing that they try and talk about in regards to learning support is the idea of individualized help. Firstly, I'll establish, I think that's actually likely to be a social harm because I think that's far more visible than your age when people are considering bullying you for not being intelligent. So I think that actually that's that's probably something that's not very strategic for them to support. But I think that actually the only reason why you need individualized help is because you're in a classroom of people that are doing work that's far more like above your like mental level. I think that just if you're in a classroom that is at your level, you don't need the individualized help in the first place because the teacher's able to focus on everyone, no thank you, and you're able to get the benefits under that side. But what we were able to establish was not only like if you're in learning support, the purpose of that was to get you to pass a subject that otherwise you were failing. What we were able to get you to do was excel in a subject that otherwise you were failing. That was the comparative difference we were able to get for you. That meant that firstly, people just had more self-esteem, again, social benefits, again, extracurriculars, we'll hint on that later. But also the benefits that we talked to you at first and we bring up at second again, which I think needs a bit more of a response, which is that there are people that would be like really good at certain things, but at the point when they graduate grade 12, and I'll take that in a second, based on their age, they're not quite at the grades that can get them into like law or medicine, but they would be awesome at it if they just had 2 more years to finish physics or something like that. We get all of those benefits, sure.
Given that you don't support individualized education support, would you like support children with learning difficulties simply being shoved in a class of 5-year-olds and just left to figure it out?
Well, I think the comparative thing here is that if you've got like a specific learning disability, I think that that's the kind of thing that a teacher in a class of people that is like all at a similar level might pay specific attention to. But I think that's still comparatively better under our side, because that also means that everyone else gets that help at the same time. Because I think, and I'll like, this kind of bleeds into the talk about like the average student. Because I think if a student is like getting individualized help in a class of everyone that's succeeding, I don't think that they get the benefit that they want to talk about high achievers extending the class. I think you probably get a case of people that are struggling that end up actually holding the class back somewhat because the teacher needs to spend extra time talking to them and explaining things. Additionally, I think that creates social harms because people resent the student for holding them back. I think that's also really problematic. Comparatively, we were able to not get that social harm and we were able to help them develop. No, thank you. But also, I think at the end of the day, if there's someone that's likely just never quite going to be able to pass a grade 12 level of maths or English, I think you do just reach a point where like people are satisfied that you have put the effort in required to prove that you are like capable of working productively within society. Because I think that, yeah, so I think that that's something that we're able to get onto our side. So at that point, we've established that we benefit everyone academically. Remember, that was the most important thing because there was no other place you could get the academic benefits. There were for social benefits. Why do we get the social benefits anyway? Let's firstly talk about, I guess, let's be really comparative about who you relate to more in this debate, whether it's based on age, whether it's based on your like intellectual ability. Because I think there are ways in which you can feel ostracized under both sides. I think that sometimes you might feel like you relate more to people that are the same age as you. But I think the specific reason for that is that people who are the same age as you, and I'll take that in a second, are also mentally developed similar to you in most instances. I think that you're attracted to people that have similar interests to you, which is likely correlated with intelligence and intellect, and people that think similarly to you on the same basis. Sure.
What do you think the situation is in terms of benefits for students who are put in a class with students who are younger than them, but then do not actually academically achieve like extremely highly?
Well, I think that the comparative thing is they probably just fail under your side and maybe they don't get A's, but they're far more likely to at least pass under our side. I think that's a colossal mental health benefit. And I think that's just like generally a benefit on the whole, because you need to establish under your side how you do get them to pass for you to get a comparative benefit there. So I think at that point, we've established that people are likely to emotionally relate to people who are at the same like intellectual level as them, because the reason why age is a correlator is that age is also a correlator of intelligence in most instances. But I also think furthermore, we were able to talk about the fact that like you can have conversations with people about the content in class. Maybe that's not the most common thing that you talk about, but it's definitely a thing that you talk about. And you probably feel really left out of that if you don't understand what's going on in class, or if you think what's going on in class is beneath you. Additionally, we got all of the benefits of co-curriculars. Their response to the co-curricular point was to say that you're more likely to engage when you're happy. But if I've already responded to why they're more likely to be happy, that means we also get all of the extra benefits we talk about under our side, which is the fact that people are told that they can't participate in like rugby if they're not getting good enough grades. We allow you to get good enough grades. We're able to have you not disillusioned with school. We're able to have to streamline things into the right places. So at the end of this speech, what we were able to establish was that everyone got a better educational experience, which was the most important thing in this debate. But even if school was also about social experiences, we also improved social experiences, we also improved teachers, we also improved co-curricular, we propose.
Speaker, what this team has tried to hinge their entire case on is the fact that they're going to get better academic outcomes, mainly for the students that in a normal class are like seen as the low achieving ones. What they failed to prove is that they are actually going to get these better academic outcomes, because as we tell you on our side of the house, there is just going to be less personalized, less individualized learning, less help for these students who need the help. They're going to be shoved into a class full of younger children who are performing at the same level as them, and then like the education system is going to be like, cool, we're dealing with these people when they may have intellectual disabilities, they may need extra support, and by putting them in these classes, we are actually disadvantaging these people that they claim is most vulnerable even more. So two things on in today's debate. Firstly, on like what they've tried to really push in their case, like the educational outcomes, and secondly on the social outcomes for the children. Okay, so firstly onto these like educational outcomes. This is what they've really tried to like win their case on. But like what we tell on our side of the house is that they failed to provide any actual outcomes, any like actual benefits for the people that they're trying to help. So firstly, let's address people of like a higher academic level. These are people that they claim are like disenfranchised in class. They don't really like understand their peers. No thank you. Firstly, what they have like firstly, what they tell you is that like when these like high achieving students are extremely unmotivated. Now, what do we tell you on our side of the house? What do we see in real life? We see that these people who are extremely doing very well in school, who are seen as like extremely intelligent, they're likely to try harder. We see that these people put immense pressure on themselves to do really well in school. This is not going to be diminished just because they feel like they are not being pushed to their full capability. Secondly, we tell you that like in most cases they are being pushed to their extreme capability. You don't see high schoolers complaining about that high school is easy. You see high schoolers complaining about how much like work they have to do, and that it's adequate for them, that it's pushing them to their extreme. We tell you that people are put in extension to push them to their full extreme, and we tell you that this is extremely effective in dealing with these people who are seen as above average. We tell you that like if they believe that these people are unmotivated in class, what we need to do is actually just like push more extension, that we need to extend them further. But what we should not do is reform the entire educational system because of this. Secondly, what they tell you in their model is that they're most likely going to push these people up to 1 or 2 years. Now, we tell you that especially in primary school, but even in high school, this is actually not going to help them academically. We tell you that 1 year difference is not going to make much difference in stimulating these people that we believe are already like adequately stimulated. But secondly, by making these people learn a lot harder things, we tell you that firstly, they may not have the basic educational foundations to absorb this extremely difficult knowledge. But secondly, which I'll get onto later, that the bad social outcomes that come with this greatly outweigh whatever marginal benefits they're even trying to claim. And thirdly, we tell you that by making them deal with much harder levels of of schooling, that they're going to actually get extremely stressed. If you're putting a kid who's not able to deal with year 10 maths into year 10 maths, they're just going to be extremely stressed. And we tell you that this is actually going to lead to worse grades for these high achieving students. But secondly, onto the academic achievements of these lower achieving students. Firstly, what we tell you at second is that they're exposed to higher achievers on our side of the house, which gives them better motivation to succeed. What we see in the counterfactual is that they're going to be really unmotivated if you put them into classes with younger people. Aside from the social outcomes that come with this, we tell you that they're going to be academically unmotivated to succeed if they are put into classes with people that are younger than them but doing the same work. We tell you that based on this, the academic outcomes of these lower achieving people is not going to improve. But secondly, we tell you that it's just an excuse for the education system to put these kids, as I've said in my intro, into a class with people that are younger than them and say that they are helping them, that there's standardized learning, that they're all getting the help they need. When in reality, we tell you that these people most often need extra help. They need learning support, teachers to actually analyze why they are not doing well at school and to help them individually overcome these difficulties, not by getting standardized education from a teacher that has been told, here are the low achieving students, you can deal with them all at once. We tell you that in practice this does not work, and that the educational achievements of these lower achieving students is not going to be improved at all, as we've outlined extensively. And thirdly, on this educational outcomes, they give you this point about teachers being overburdened, they're not sleeping, they're not eating, but on their side of the house, apparently they're going to they're going to be more successful teachers because they're going to have more effective teaching, because they're going to be able to cater for these students that are all at the same level. Firstly, we tell you that these teachers are going to be dealing with kids with a wide array of learning difficulties that realistically need individual help. That this teacher is going to be more stressed dealing with an entire class of kids that all should have individual support that they have to deal with in a standardized fashion. We tell you that this is just not going to be successful for the kid, but also for the teacher, who is just going to end up more stressed. Secondly, we tell you that teachers are going to be more overburdened dealing with the many emotional levels of the children in their classes. We think it's easier for teachers to cater for a group of 10-year-olds that are maybe of slightly different intellectual capabilities. We tell you it's extremely difficult for a teacher to cater for a class from 13 years old down to 8 years old. We tell you that these kids need different things. They behave in different manners, and teachers are just going to end up being a lot more stressed out on their side of the house. And then secondly, onto this point of social outcomes, this is where we believe we win this debate, because they told you that social outcomes do not matter as much as academic outcomes, because kids have other ways of socializing, that school is not the only way. What do we tell you on this? Firstly, we tell you that school is the most prominent way of socializing, especially when you're a kid. When you're in primary school or even early secondary school, school is where you go to meet people, where you talk to your friends, and where you develop relationships, right? We don't see young people actively seeking these out beyond school, which is their primary way to socialize. So The same way again, upper academic level. So firstly, on social, what they on social outcomes, what they ignore is firstly that we tell you that like academic levels aren't correlated to maturity. I think this is something that they've like largely ignored. They tell you that like these higher achieving students often feel disillusioned with their classmates, that they're not able to like get through to them when they're conversating. Okay, we tell you that just branding a smart kid as only wanting to talk about literature and news is basically like absurd. We tell you that, like, for example, a 12-year-old boy, no matter how smart he is going to talk about video games with his friends. We think this is just something that exists, and this is not something that the opposition can't ignore. However, and also on our side of the house, in extension, they are still in extension with peers of the same age in which they are able to converse with them. On the opposition side of the house, they would be with much older kids, which in itself is bad because they are overexposed to issues, as we've told you before, that are beyond what their age can deal with, such as like alcohol and drugs for a 12-year-old, which we believe that they are not developmentally capable with dealing. And then thirdly, what they've largely ignored is this like point we bring up a second about huge parental pressure. These kids are already facing a lot of parental pressure when they're high achieving. We believe this is only going to be exacerbated when their parents are pushing them to get into a higher grade, as it's seen as like a kind of social status symbol. And then lastly, on this point of like these kids with lower academic levels, what they've largely ignored is that the hit to your self-esteem is so much larger when you are being held back a year and put in a class with younger children than when you are just not doing as well in a class, but you are getting the individualized support that you are getting. We tell you that like the self-esteem of these children when they're shoved into a lower class, combined with this like kind of othering, like casting aside by their younger classmates for being like a weird idiot who's like 3 years in a class 3 with people 3 years younger than they should be, that's a huge hit to these kids' self-esteem. And we tell you that like this is extremely like developmentally detrimental to both kids of an upper academic like achievement and lower academic achievement, and that is why I'm proud to
Speaker, this was an affirmative team who were willing to hinge their entire case on academic benefits that were not guaranteed in a situation where they were able to put both high achieving and low achieving students in a situation where their mental health will deteriorate to an extent where they're not actually able to engage with their education in any meaningful way. And therefore, not only are they not able to claim these education benefits, they also create students in the long term who are not actually able to engage with an adult society in a way that we see as being beneficial. So two main things I'll be discussing. Like firstly, the way this impacts academic success, and secondly, the way this impacts the development of the child. So firstly, onto the academic success. We told like firstly, in terms of academic achievers, we see them as being individuals who would benefit most from academic extension, with students of their own age. We tell you in these sorts of situations, they're able to engage in critical thinking situations, in like classroom activities that are not what the normal student does, but are able to extend them in such a way that they're doing something completely different to other students and therefore are actually able to extend themselves in a way they would not be able to do in a mainstream classroom, whether or not that was with students of their own age. And therefore, we are able to actually get an engagement and interest of high achieving students under the status quo. So then, like, secondly, onto like these more average students, we tell you that they're probably more motivated and more interested in a classroom in which they're able to engage with higher achieving students who are able to bring like a nuance to conversations that when you have a classroom of students who are all the same academic ability, you're not necessarily able to get. We see this as being a benefit to these students. But then thirdly, onto like low achieving students who we see as having like the most to lose under the opposition's case. We tell you that like firstly, they're not able to like receive the individualized support and help that they so crucially need. We discussed with you about these kind of particular students who receive learning support under the status quo, who have education assistance. And we tell you that in a situation that the opposition supports, in which we do not have the same level of individualized help, these students are not actually able to get a better educational outcome because they're not receiving that support that they've always been able to have. And particularly in the short term, when this is taken away immediately, we see this as having huge negative impacts on the educational outcomes of these children. And then secondly, we tell you that oftentimes this will be used as an excuse by schools to kind of leave these students to their own devices, to not actually engage with them in a meaningful way, and feel that they have helped enough simply by putting these students in a classroom of kids who are many, many years younger than them by an arbitrary assessment of academic achievement that does not take into account the social needs of these children, where their maturity lies, who they're actually able to engage with in the most meaningful way. So then note then at the end of this point, we don't actually get an academic benefit substantially for any of these children in any of these situations, and therefore we do not have any justification for allowing this massive change to happen to the education system. But then on to the primary harm that we see here. Not only is there no justification, there's a very large inherent harm. Firstly, we tell you that particularly in the case of lower achievers, mental health will be completely destroyed under the opposition's model. These students are not necessarily going to achieve highly. They're not necessarily going to get this A or this pass that the opposition have proposed. Rather, what they're going to receive is bullying, the wreckage of their self-esteem by being told, particularly from a very young age, that they're not as capable as their peers, and being left with students who are far younger than them, who are therefore not on socially the same level as them. Secondly, we tell you that the opposition cannot claim benefits to the social capacity of these children. We tell you that them claiming that children are able to engage with social activities outside of school is not the benefit that we actually need in this debate. What we need is a situation where students are able to engage with the other children within their classroom, and we shouldn't just be leaving children to engage outside of school, because the actual engagement within the classroom is vitally important to the development of children. But finally, we tell you that these students are placed under an unrealistic degree of pressure, which creates a system in which they're not able to succeed, and rather they're completely crushed and weighed down by huge mental health implications long term. For these reasons, so proud to negate.
I now call on the affirmative reply speaker, Cheltenham Rutledge.
There is a tension in this side opposition side, because they themselves tell you that there are problems with the status quo. Their solution, the status quo, challenge programs which are inaccessible and ultimately fail to deal with the nature of reality, which was that currently in schools all over Australia, those who needed extensions couldn't get it. And if they did, it was to a limited extent. That those who were average and just needed support from teachers couldn't ever access it because teachers were forced to spend their time dealing with students who were struggling in their class. And those students who were struggling were told that because they were developing at a rate different to their peers, they were failing in that class, and that because of that, school wasn't a place for them, and that class was ultimately being hurt because of their mere existence in it. That wasn't acceptable. They themselves tell you there's a problem in the status quo. We are the only side that fixes it. Two questions in this reply. Firstly, which side gets better educational outcomes? And secondly, which side gets better social benefits? On the first, educational outcomes. Again, both sides to some extent agree that the status quo is failing. In a modelling sense, though, side opposition points to challenge programs and learning support. This was a halfway response that ultimately failed to deal with the problem. It had harms with resourcing, it had harms with accessibility. But note, crucially, that all of the social benefits that they wanted to tether to class discussions and engagement were ultimately lost when they themselves point to things like challenge programs which take kids out of class, or learning support, which means that the only person you can talk to in that class is a teacher's aide who is sitting by you the entire time. So if they wanted to hedge their bets on social benefits, the very model they support and they propose ultimately fails. The reason we were able to get the social benefits that they themselves wanted to talk about was because you were in a class of people who were of the same academic ability as you. There was literally a full room of individuals who were on the same level that was fundamentally different to a teacher's aide sitting next to you or a challenge program where you literally couldn't converse with a class if that was so important. On the three types of students in this debate. Firstly, high-level learners. They tell you that they push themselves under the status quo. We told you that was literally impossible at the point at which you couldn't access higher levels of learning. It's all good and well that you're an year 8 student who wanted to do year 10 maths, but at the point at which you couldn't sit in a year 10 classroom, that challenge wasn't something you could actively take up. That ultimately meant that you failed these students because they were sat in classes with material that was too easy for them, which meant they disengaged and probably became hugely disillusioned with the status quo's education system. On struggling students, they tell you you shouldn't put students in classes with those that are younger than them because of ostracization. That was wholly uncomparative because the status quo meant that sure, that individual was in a class of individuals who were the same age as them, that they felt stupid. They felt dumb, and they felt they couldn't engage with their peers on a meaningful level because they couldn't understand or grasp the content in some way. It was crucially important that we changed the norm around what classes were in order to mean that you weren't ostracized because you were a younger or older age. It was just the fact that you were there because of ability. That's what we got. On the average student, because ultimately teachers were able to target resources better, they weren't left in the middle of the bell curve to their own devices. They were prioritized by a teacher who is now empowered to deal with them in a meaningful way. Educational outcomes were the most important thing in this debate, because this is what the purpose of school was. And educational outcomes allowed you to access your passions. It allowed you to become a doctor or become that lawyer. It allowed you to access the higher quality of living that only education could provide you. That's why social outcomes were ultimately less important. But even if they weren't, why did we ultimately get better social outcomes for students? Firstly, it's an important observation to note that school, because it's a place of learning, doesn't account for much time of interactions in the classroom. That is a time where you're literally listening to a teacher. That is not a time where you're conversing with friends. This is material we gave you at Harry. But secondly, on who students will be friends with. Down the bench, we tell you that just because you're a different age group to people didn't necessarily mean you didn't relate. In my speech, I told you that it is likely that you're probably just shifted a few grades up or a few grades down, which meant you were able to meaningfully engage with those students. At the end of this speech, the status quo failed students. We were the only side brave enough to fix it. So proud to propose.